Today's testimony was shared with us from Ali Hosseini, a 41-year-old exile now in Toronto, Canada, where he battles the shadows of a dark past. Once a devout Muslim, kissed by the sacred black stone at Mecca, Ali was bound in the rigid grip of Islam until a spiritual awakening shattered his world. Fleeing Iran's oppressive faith, he faced family betrayal and the haunting loss of his children, only to find redemption in Jesus Christ. Join us now as Ali unveils his gripping journey from the chains of evil to the light of divine salvation. Listen and be blessed. My name is Ali, and I am sitting in my small apartment in Toronto, Canada, watching the autumn leaves drift past my window in the gentle September breeze. The silence here is different from the silence I knew growing up in Tehran. There, silence was filled with the distant hum of motorcycles, the call to prayer echoing from minarets, and the soft murmur of my mother's prayers from the next room. Here, silence is just empty. But I need to go back to the beginning to help you understand how a man who once kissed the black stone at Kaaba could end up where I am today, cut off from everything I once called home. I was born into faith, the way some people are born into wealth or poverty. It was simply the air I breathed. My father, Hassan, was a respected man in our neighborhood in South Tehran. He owned a small carpet shop that had been in our family for 3 generations, and every morning before opening the store, he would perform his prayers with a devotion that seemed to make the very walls of our house sacred. I can still see him now, his weathered hands spread on the prayer rug my grandmother had woven, his lips moving silently as he communed with Allah. My mother, Fatima, was the kind of woman who could recite entire chapters of the Quran from memory while preparing dinner for 8 people. She wore her faith like a beautiful chador. It covered her completely and made her somehow more radiant. During Ramadan, our house became a gathering place for extended family, and I remember the way the evening call to prayer would find us all seated around plates of dates and glasses of sweet tea, breaking our fast together in a ritual that felt as old as time itself. I was the eldest of 4 children, and with that came responsibility. Every Friday, I walked beside my father to the mosque, my small hand in his large, calloused one. The mosque in our neighborhood was not grand like the ones you see in photographs, but it was ours. I knew every tile in its courtyard, every spot where the afternoon sun would warm the stones just right for a young boy to sit and listen to the old ulemas discuss matters of faith and community. The Imam Haji Reza had a beard that seemed to hold wisdom in every gray strand. He would place his hand on my head after prayers and tell my father that I was a blessed child, that I had the eyes of one who would grow close to Allah. These words filled me with a pride that was both humbling and elevating. I memorized verses of the Quran, not because I had to, but because each word felt like a treasure I was storing in my heart. When I turned 16, my father began taking me to the carpet shop after school. I learned to identify the intricate patterns that told stories of our Persian heritage. The tree of life, the garden of paradise, the endless knots that represented the infinite nature of Allah's love. As I swept the floors and arranged the carpets, my father would tell me stories of our ancestors, men who had been scholars and poets, who had served kings and taught children, all while keeping their faith as the center of their lives. It was in that shop that I first heard my father speak of the possibility of Hajj. We had been saving money for years, he said, and perhaps when I turned 21, we could make the pilgrimage together. The thought filled me with such excitement that I could barely sleep for weeks. To walk where the Prophet had walked, to join millions of believers from around the world in the ultimate act of submission and worship, it seemed like the most beautiful dream imaginable. But life had other plans first. When I was 19, my parents began speaking to me about marriage. In our community, this was not something that caused anxiety or rebellion. It was the natural order of things, as expected and welcomed as the changing of seasons. They had found a suitable family, they said, with a daughter named Zara, who was educated from a good family and possessed of both beauty and strong Islamic values. I met Zara 3 times before our engagement, always in the presence of our families, always with the kind of formal courtesy that seems strange to Western minds, but felt perfectly natural to us then. She was indeed beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed both modest and intelligent. She had completed her studies at university and spoke passionately about wanting to raise children who would be both educated and faithful. During our brief conversations, I found myself imagining a life filled with the same kind of contentment I had witnessed in my parents' marriage. Our wedding was a celebration that lasted 3 days. The mosque was filled with flowers and the voices of family friends singing traditional songs of blessing. I remember the moment when I first saw Zara in her wedding dress, her hands decorated with intricate henna patterns, her eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and joy that I felt echoing in my own heart. We were both 22, both believers, both ready to build a life that would honor Allah and our families. The early years of our marriage were filled with a contentment I had not known was possible. Zara was not just a wife, but a companion in faith. We would read the Quran together in the evenings, and she would ask questions that made me think more deeply about passages I had known by heart since childhood. She challenged me to be a better Muslim, not through criticism, but through her own example of devotion and service. When our daughter Maryam was born, I felt as though I finally understood what the poets meant when they wrote about the mercy of Allah. Holding her tiny form, watching her sleep in the crib that my father had carved by hand, I was overwhelmed by a gratitude so profound it brought tears to my eyes during my prayers. This child was a gift, a trust, a responsibility that felt both humbling and sacred. By the time Maryam took her first steps, my father had saved enough money for both of us to make Hajj. The day we received confirmation that our applications had been accepted, my mother prepared a feast and invited the entire extended family to celebrate. I remember my uncle Ahmad clasping my shoulder and telling me that I was blessed among men to make the pilgrimage so young, that most people waited decades for such an opportunity. The preparation for Hajj consumed months of our lives. There were medical examinations, spiritual counseling sessions with our imam, and countless hours spent learning about the rituals we would perform. Zara helped me pack my white garments, her fingers careful and reverent, as she folded the simple cloth that would strip away all worldly distinctions and make me equal with every other pilgrim, whether he be a king or a beggar. The flight to Saudi Arabia was my first time leaving Iran. As the airplane lifted off from Tehran's airport, I pressed my face to the window and watched my homeland grow smaller below us, feeling a mixture of excitement and homesickness that I had never experienced before. My father sat beside me, his prayer beads moving through his fingers in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my heart. Mecca was overwhelming in every sense. The crowds, the heat, the constant sound of prayers being offered in dozens of languages. It was like stepping into the very center of the Islamic world. But what struck me most was not the grandeur of the great mosque, or even the sight of the Kaaba, that black cube that every Muslim faces during prayer. It was the faces of the pilgrims, men and women from every corner of the earth, all wearing the same simple white garments, all with the same expression of hope and reverence. I saw Indonesian farmers walking beside Nigerian doctors, elderly Pakistani women helping young Malaysian students, American converts teaching Arabic phrases to confused but eager European Muslims. In that crowd, I felt a unity that seemed to transcend every division that normally separates human beings. The rituals of Hajj are designed to humble you, to remind you of your mortality and your dependence on Allah's mercy. Walking 7 times around the Kaaba, I found myself weeping without knowing why. Running between the hills of Safa and Marwa, reenacting Hagar's desperate search for water, I felt connected to a story that was both ancient and immediate. Standing on the plain of Arafat with 2 million other pilgrims, all of us facing the same direction, all of us asking for forgiveness, I experienced what I can only describe as the presence of the divine. My father and I barely spoke during those days. Words seemed inadequate for what we were experiencing. But I remember the moment when we were permitted to touch the black stone. As my hand made contact with that ancient rock, polished smooth by millions of faithful hands before mine, I felt as though I was touching a piece of heaven itself. The continuity of faith, stretching back through centuries to Abraham and Ishmael, seemed to flow through that stone into my very soul. When we returned to Tehran, we were different men. Our neighbors and family treated us with a new kind of respect. We had become Hajis, men who had completed the 5th pillar of Islam, men who had stood in the very presence of Allah and returned to tell of it. I felt this responsibility keenly. I began attending mosque more regularly, not just on Fridays, but for the daily prayers whenever possible. I started teaching Quranic studies to the young men in our neighborhood, passing on not just the verses, but the love for Islam that seemed to burn more brightly in me after Mecca. Zara was pregnant with our 2nd child when I returned from Hajj, and I remember placing my hands on her growing belly and praying that this child too would grow up to love Allah and follow the straight path. Everything in our life seemed blessed, ordained, perfectly aligned with the will of the Almighty. I expanded my father's carpet business, and we began importing rugs not just from within Iran but from other Islamic countries, Afghanistan, Turkey, Pakistan. Each carpet told the story of Muslim artisans, and I took pride in knowing that our shop was not just a business, but a celebration of Islamic culture and craftsmanship. Customers would often stay to chat about the geometric patterns that reflected the mathematical precision of Allah's creation, or the calligraphy that turned verses from the Quran into art. Our extended family continued to gather at our house for religious holidays. I remember Ashura celebrations where we would tell the stories of Hussein's martyrdom, and everyone from my youngest cousin to my eldest uncle would weep at the injustice and sacrifice we commemorated. During Eid celebrations, our house would fill with the sounds of children playing and adults discussing everything from politics to theology, all within the framework of our shared faith. But even in those golden years, there were whispers of change in Iran. The Islamic Revolution had transformed our country, and there were adjustments that all of us had to make. New laws, new expectations, new ways of demonstrating our faith and loyalty. Most of these seemed natural to me then. Of course, a truly Islamic society would require its citizens to live according to Islamic principles. Of course, there would be rules about dress and behavior and public conduct. These were small prices to pay for the privilege of living in a nation that put Allah at the center of its governance. I remember defending these changes to my cousin Reza, who had always been more secular in his thinking. We would have long discussions about the role of religion in government, and I would quote verses from the Quran and sayings from the Prophet to support my belief that an Islamic state was not just permissible but preferable to the corruption and godlessness we saw in Western societies. I felt sorry for Reza then, concerned that his education in engineering had somehow led him away from the simple truths that seemed so clear to me. When my son Darius was born, 2 years after my return from Hajj, I held him during the call to prayer and whispered the Shahada into his ear, just as my father had done for me, and his father had done for him. This was the chain of faith that connected us to the very beginning of Islam, and I was proud to be one more link in that unbroken connection. Those were the happiest years of my life, though I did not know it then. I thought that was simply how life was meant to be, surrounded by family, grounded in faith, secure in the knowledge that I was pleasing to Allah and contributing to a righteous society. I had everything a Muslim man could want. A loving wife who shared my beliefs, healthy children I was raising in the faith, a successful business, the respect of my community, and the peace that comes from knowing exactly what Allah expects of you. At night, as I performed my final prayers before sleep, I would thank Allah for these blessings and ask for the wisdom to be worthy of them. I had no way of knowing that questions were already forming in the deeper parts of my mind, questions that would eventually unravel everything I thought I knew about faith, truth, and the nature of God Himself. But that darkness was still years away. For now, there was only light, the light of certainty, the light of community, the light of a faith that seemed as solid and eternal as the mountains that surrounded Tehran. I was Ali Hosseini, devoted son, faithful husband, proud father, and servant of the Most High. I had kissed the black stone and felt the presence of Allah. I had everything I needed to be happy forever. How was I to know that forever was about to end? The first crack in my foundation came not through reading or philosophy, but through the eyes of a young woman whose only crime was wanting to feel the wind in her hair. It was the summer of 2009, and Tehran was electric with tension, following the presidential election. The streets buzzed with an energy that felt both exciting and dangerous, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I was 31 years old, successful in my business, respected in my community, and I thought I understood the world around me. I supported the Islamic Republic because I believed it represented the purest form of government, one guided by divine law rather than human corruption. The protests that followed the election troubled me at first. Surely these young people were being misled by Western propaganda, I thought. Surely they didn't understand how blessed we were to live in a nation that honored Allah above all else. I watched the early demonstrations from the windows of my carpet shop, shaking my head at what seemed like foolish rebellion against righteous authority. But then I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 19, walking with a group of her friends past my shop. She was wearing her hijab loosely, her hair visible in a way that was technically illegal, but had become common among young women in Tehran. She was laughing at something one of her friends had said, and there was such life in her face, such innocent joy, that I found myself smiling despite my disapproval of her immodest dress. The morality police arrived so quickly that I barely saw them coming. 3 men in plain clothes surrounded her and her friends, and suddenly the laughter stopped. I watched from behind my shop window as they grabbed her roughly by the arms, shouting at her about her improper hijab. Her friends tried to intervene, but they were pushed aside. What happened next will haunt me until I die. The girl, and I keep calling her a girl because that's all she was, fell to her knees and began pleading. Not defiantly or angrily, but with the kind of desperate fear that comes from genuine terror. She was begging, promising to cover herself properly, apologizing over and over for her mistake. But they dragged her away anyway. I stood there in my shop, surrounded by beautiful carpets that celebrated Islamic art and culture, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This girl had hurt no one. She had been walking down the street, laughing with her friends, guilty of nothing more than letting a few strands of hair show in the sunlight. And for this, she had been taken away by men who claimed to act in the name of Allah. That night I tried to pray as usual, but the words felt strange in my mouth. I found myself thinking about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and how he had treated women. Had he ever ordered young girls to be dragged away for showing their hair? The stories I knew spoke of his kindness, his mercy, his protection of the vulnerable. How did those stories connect to what I had witnessed that afternoon? I told myself this was just my emotional reaction, that I was letting my feelings cloud my judgment. The law was the law, and modest dress was required for the good of society. Women needed to be protected from the lustful gazes of men, and if they wouldn't protect themselves, then society had to protect them. These were the arguments I had used countless times before, the logic that had always satisfied me. But when I closed my eyes that night, I kept seeing her face, young, terrified, begging for mercy that never came. The protests grew larger and more frequent over the following weeks. I watched from my shop as thousands of young Iranians took to the streets, demanding to have their votes counted, demanding to be heard. The government's response grew harsher with each passing day. I began to see things that challenged everything I believed about our Islamic state. Young men beaten bloody for carrying signs. Women arrested for filming the violence on their phones. Families searching desperately for children who had been taken in the night and hadn't been heard from since. These weren't foreign agitators or paid troublemakers. These were my neighbors, my customers, the children of people I had known for years. My cousin Reza visited me during this time, and I found our usual discussions about politics taking on a new urgency. He had always been skeptical of the government, but now he was openly critical in a way that made me uncomfortable. He spoke about the gap between Islamic ideals and Islamic reality, about how power corrupts even those who claim to serve God. I argued with him, but my arguments felt weaker than they once had. When he asked me how the Prophet would have treated the protesters, I found myself struggling to answer. When he pointed out that the wealthy mullahs lived in luxury while ordinary people struggled, I couldn't explain how this aligned with Islamic teachings about justice and equality. One evening, Reza brought me a book, a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, written by a respected Islamic scholar. It wasn't a criticism of Islam, but a careful, scholarly examination of the historical record. I was reluctant to read it at first, feeling that my faith was strong enough without needing to examine its foundations so closely. But curiosity got the better of me. What I read shook me more than I want to admit. The author presented a Muhammad who was undoubtedly a great leader and a transformative figure, but who was also a man of his time, making decisions based on the political and social realities of 7th century Arabia. Some of these decisions, when examined closely, were difficult to reconcile with the perfect eternal model I had always believed the Prophet to be. The treatment of certain tribes after military victories, the marriages that seemed to serve political purposes, the verses of the Quran that appeared to address very specific situations in ways that favored Muhammad's position. All of this was presented not as criticism, but as historical context. Yet it left me with questions I had never allowed myself to ask before. I tried to discuss these questions with my imam, but Haji Reza seemed uncomfortable with my inquiries. He reminded me that questioning too deeply was a sign of weak faith, that Allah had given us everything we needed to know in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. Doubts, he said, were whispers from Satan, designed to lead the faithful astray. But the doubts wouldn't go away. I began to notice things I had overlooked before. The way certain verses of the Quran seemed to contradict others. The way Islamic history was filled with violence and division, almost from the beginning. The way the most devout believers often treated each other with shocking cruelty, all while claiming to follow the religion of peace. My business brought me into contact with Muslims from other countries, and I began to ask careful questions about how Islam was practiced in their homelands. What I learned disturbed me. The Sunni-Shia divide that had torn apart the Islamic world. The way different schools of Islamic law came to completely opposite conclusions about the same issues. The endless wars fought between Muslim nations, each claiming that Allah was on their side. During this time, my relationship with Zahra began to change. She sensed my growing uncertainty, though I tried to hide it from her. When I stopped attending the mosque regularly, she asked if I was ill. When I began to pray less consistently, she wondered if work was troubling me. I made excuses, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The worst part was that I still loved Islam, or at least I loved what I had always thought Islam was. The sense of brotherhood, the emphasis on charity and justice, the beautiful poetry of the Quran, the rich traditions that had shaped my identity since birth. I didn't want to lose these things, but I was beginning to suspect that the religion I loved might be something I had created in my own mind, rather than something that actually existed in the world. My cousin Reza and I grew closer during this period. He had been questioning religion for years, he told me, but had kept his doubts to himself to avoid family conflict. When he sensed that I was struggling with similar questions, he began to open up to me about his journey toward agnosticism. He introduced me to other young Iranians who had walked away from Islam, not in anger or rebellion, but in sorrow and confusion. We began meeting informally at each other's homes, sharing our questions and our pain. These weren't wild radicals or Western-influenced intellectuals. They were ordinary people who had tried their best to be good Muslims, but had found themselves unable to continue believing. One of them, a young woman named Nasreen, had been studying to become an Islamic scholar before her faith collapsed. She spoke about the day she realized that she was bending her mind into impossible shapes, trying to make the Quran say things it clearly didn't say, trying to make historical events fit a narrative that required ignoring half the evidence. Another, a man named Farid, who had been a prayer leader at his local mosque, described the moment he admitted to himself that he was performing rituals he no longer believed in, leading prayers to a God he was no longer sure existed. The weight of that hypocrisy, he said, had nearly crushed him. Their stories resonated with my own experience in ways that terrified me. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just questioning certain practices or interpretations. I was questioning the entire foundation of my worldview. The crisis came to a head during Ramadan that year. I had always loved the holy month, the sense of spiritual discipline and community unity it brought. But as I sat breaking fast with my family, listening to my father read from the Quran in his beautiful voice, I felt like a fraud. Every verse he recited raised new questions in my mind. Every prayer felt like a lie. That night, alone in my room, I opened the Quran to read as I had done thousands of times before. But instead of comfort and guidance, I found myself cataloging contradictions and troubling passages. Verses about fighting unbelievers that seemed to encourage the very violence I had witnessed in the streets. Commands about the treatment of women that made me think of that terrified girl being dragged away by the morality police. Stories about the Prophet's military campaigns that seemed to glorify conquest and vengeance. I closed the book and sat in the darkness, trembling with a fear deeper than any I had ever known. If Islam was not true, if the Quran was not the perfect word of Allah, if Muhammad was not the perfect example for all humanity, if the Islamic Republic was not a righteous government guided by divine law, then what was I? Without my faith, I was nobody. Without my beliefs, I had no identity. Without my certainty about Allah and His will, I had no foundation for any moral or ethical decision. I was 31 years old, and everything I had built my life upon was crumbling beneath my feet. I tried to pray that night, but the words wouldn't come. I tried to feel Allah's presence, but there was only silence. I tried to summon the faith that had once seemed as natural as breathing, but found only questions where answers used to be. For the first time in my life, I wondered if Allah might not exist at all. The thought hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with its implications. If there was no Allah, then there was no ultimate meaning to anything. No divine plan, no eternal reward, no cosmic justice. Just human beings stumbling around in the dark, making up stories to comfort themselves in the face of mortality and meaninglessness. I spent that night crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Not just for my lost faith, but for the man I had been, the certainty I had enjoyed, the peace I had known. That Ali, the believer, the pilgrim, the faithful son and husband, was dying, and I didn't know who would be born in his place. When morning came, I was still sitting in the same spot, staring at the closed Quran on my desk. The call to prayer echoed across Tehran as it had every morning of my life. But for the first time, it sounded like nothing more than human voices making noise in an empty sky. I was no longer a Muslim, though I didn't yet have the courage to admit it even to myself. I was no longer certain of anything, though I would continue pretending for months to come. I was lost, afraid, and utterly alone, even while surrounded by the family and community that had once been my whole world. The foundation that had once seemed unshakable had cracked beyond repair. Now I had to learn how to live in the ruins. The months after my faith collapsed were the darkest of my life. I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions of being a Muslim while feeling completely hollow inside. Every prayer was a lie, every religious observance was an act of deception, and every conversation about faith felt like betraying both my family and myself. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't share my doubts with Zahra, who remained as devout as ever. I watched her pray with the same peaceful concentration I remembered from my own believing days. And I envied her more than I can express. She still had certainty. She still had that sense of divine presence that had once made life feel meaningful and purposeful. She still believed that our daughter and son were growing up under the protection of a loving God who had a plan for their lives. I, meanwhile, felt like I was watching my children grow up in what might be a completely random universe, where suffering was meaningless and death was final. The thought kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to raise kids with any sense of morality or purpose if there was no ultimate foundation for either. My relationship with my parents became increasingly strained. They could sense something was wrong, but when they asked if I was troubled about anything, I made excuses about business stress or worry about the political situation. How could I tell my father, who had saved for years to take me to Mecca, that I now thought the Kaaba was just a building and the black stone was just a rock? How could I explain to my mother, who had spent her whole life in service to Allah, that I was no longer sure Allah existed? The guilt was overwhelming. These people had poured their lives into raising me to be a good Muslim. They had sacrificed for my religious education, celebrated my spiritual milestones, and taken pride in my devotion. Now, I was essentially telling myself that their entire worldview was built on illusions, while being too cowardly to tell them directly. My cousin Reza became my lifeline during this period. He was the only person who understood what I was going through, having traveled the same path from faith to doubt to something resembling acceptance. We would meet for long walks in the northern hills of Tehran, away from family and neighbors, and I would pour out my confusion and fear. He introduced me to other former Muslims, and I was amazed to discover how many of us there were. We called ourselves nothing. We had no name for what we had become because admitting what we had become was too dangerous. But we found each other through careful networks of trust. And we supported each other through the terrible loneliness of losing our faith in a society where faith was everything. Most of these people, I learned, had kept their loss of belief secret for years. There were successful businessmen who continued to attend Friday prayers while privately thinking it was all nonsense. There were women who wore their hijabs and fasted during Ramadan while no longer believing in the God they were supposedly serving. There were even a few who worked for religious institutions while having lost all faith in what those institutions represented. The psychological toll of this double life was enormous. I began to understand why so many young Iranians were struggling with depression and anxiety. When you can't be honest about your deepest beliefs or lack of beliefs with anyone in your life, when you have to pretend to be someone you're not every single day, the strain becomes almost unbearable. My work in the carpet shop became a refuge because it was the one place where I could focus on something beautiful without having to think about its religious significance. The intricate patterns that had once reminded me of Allah's infinite creativity now simply represented human artistic achievement. The calligraphy that had once been sacred text became elegant decoration. It was a relief to appreciate these things for their earthly beauty rather than their spiritual meaning. But even this simple pleasure was complicated by guilt. I felt like I was dishonoring the craftsmen who had created these works as expressions of their faith. I was selling carpets to customers who valued them partly for their Islamic heritage, while I no longer shared that heritage myself. Every transaction felt like a small betrayal. The political situation in Iran continued to deteriorate, and this only deepened my disillusionment. The government crackdown on protesters had been brutal, and I saw young people I knew disappear into prisons where they were reportedly tortured and abused. All of this was being done in the name of protecting Islamic values by men who claimed to be servants of a merciful and compassionate God. I began to understand that my loss of faith wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger crisis affecting my entire generation. The Islamic Republic had promised to create a society based on divine justice, but what we got instead was corruption, oppression, and hypocrisy on a massive scale. The gap between Islamic ideals and Islamic reality had become so vast that many young Iranians simply gave up on the religion altogether. This realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant I wasn't alone or crazy. My doubts were shared by thousands of others who had eyes to see what was happening around us. Terrifying because it meant that the foundation of our entire society might be as hollow as my own faith had become. I tried to find some middle ground, some way to maintain a connection to Islamic culture and ethics without having to believe in Islamic theology. I read books by progressive Muslim thinkers who argued for reformed interpretations of the faith. I explored Sufi poetry and philosophy, hoping to find a mystical approach that might feel more authentic than orthodox belief. But nothing worked. Once the questions had started, they wouldn't stop. Every reformed interpretation still required me to believe things I couldn't accept. Every mystical approach still demanded faith in supernatural claims I found unconvincing. I began to understand that I wasn't just having problems with certain aspects of Islam. I was having problems with religious thinking itself. The concept of agnosticism, which Reza had introduced me to, began to make more sense. I couldn't prove that God didn't exist, but I also couldn't see any convincing evidence that he did. The universe seemed to operate according to natural laws rather than divine intervention. Human behavior seemed to be explained better by psychology and sociology than by the presence or absence of spiritual forces. But accepting agnosticism meant accepting that I might never have certainty about anything ultimate ever again. It meant living with questions instead of answers, doubt instead of faith, probability instead of absolute truth. For someone who had grown up with the rock-solid certainty of Islamic belief, this felt like learning to breathe underwater. My marriage began to suffer more seriously during this period. Zara knew something was deeply wrong, but she interpreted my changes in the worst possible way. She wondered if I was having an affair, if I had gotten involved in some kind of illegal business, if I had developed a gambling or drug problem. These explanations made more sense to her than the truth, that I had simply stopped believing in God. Our conversations became more strained and less frequent. She would try to engage me in discussions about the children's religious education or about plans for the upcoming Hajj season, and I would give non-committal responses that frustrated her. She started taking over more of the religious instruction for Maryam and Darius, and I felt both guilty for abandoning that responsibility and relieved not to have to lie to my own children about what I believed. The children, meanwhile, were growing up in this atmosphere of hidden tension. Maryam, who was now 7, began asking me fewer questions about religious matters and turning more to her mother for spiritual guidance. Darius, at 5, still looked up to me with complete trust, which made me feel even worse about the example I was setting for him. I found myself wondering what kind of father I could be without faith to guide me. How do you teach your children right from wrong if you don't believe in divine commandments? How do you comfort them when they're afraid if you don't believe in divine protection? How do you give them hope for the future if you don't believe in divine justice? These questions tormented me, but I couldn't find satisfactory answers. The secular ethics I was reading about seemed thin and unsatisfying compared to the robust moral framework I had grown up with. Humanist philosophy made intellectual sense, but didn't provide the emotional resonance that religious belief had offered. I felt like I was trying to build a house without a foundation. By the time 3 years had passed since my crisis of faith began, I had settled into a kind of numb acceptance of my situation. I was no longer actively searching for answers or hoping to recover my lost belief. I was simply trying to survive each day without causing too much damage to the people I loved. But this equilibrium was fragile, and I knew it couldn't last forever. The strain of living a double life was wearing me down. The distance between me and Zara was growing wider. My relationship with my parents was becoming increasingly artificial. My ability to be a good father was compromised by my inability to be honest about my deepest convictions. Something had to change, but I couldn't imagine what that change might look like. I was trapped between a religious community I could no longer honestly belong to and a secular world I wasn't sure I wanted to join. I had lost my faith, but hadn't found anything to replace it. I was neither a believer nor a confident unbeliever, just a confused man stumbling through the ruins of his former certainties. It was during this period of spiritual limbo that the opportunity arose to leave Iran. A business contact in Canada had offered me a partnership in importing Persian carpets to North America. The visa process would be complicated and expensive, but it would give me a chance to start over in a country where religious belief was optional rather than mandatory. At first, I dismissed the idea. How could I abandon my family, my heritage, everything that had shaped me? But as the political situation in Iran continued to worsen and my personal situation became more unbearable, emigration began to seem like the only path forward. Zara was opposed to the idea from the beginning. She couldn't understand why I would want to leave a society that honored Islam for one that was dominated by secular values and Christian culture. She worried about raising our children in an environment where they would be constantly exposed to influences that might weaken their faith. She feared that we would lose our identity as Iranians and Muslims if we moved to the West. Her concerns were valid, but they were also exactly why I needed to go. I needed to be somewhere where I could explore my doubts without fear of persecution, where I could be honest about my beliefs without destroying my family's reputation, where I could figure out who I was when I wasn't being forced to pretend to be someone else. The decision to leave without my family was the most agonizing of my life. Zara refused to come with me, saying she would not raise her children in a godless country. She accused me of abandoning my responsibilities, of choosing my own convenience over my family's welfare. In her mind, I was running away from problems that could be solved through prayer and renewed commitment to faith. If only she had known that faith itself was the problem I was running from. The visa process took almost 2 years, during which time I lived in a strange suspension between my old life and my new one. I continued working in the carpet shop, continued attending family gatherings, continued going through the motions of being a husband and father. But increasingly, I felt like I was just marking time until I could escape. When my visa was finally approved, the goodbye was heartbreaking beyond anything I had imagined. Miriam, now 9, cried and begged me not to go. Darius, 7 years old, couldn't understand why his father was leaving and kept asking when I would come back. I told him it would be soon, knowing it might be years before we saw each other again. Zara's goodbye was cold and formal. She was hurt and angry, and she had every right to be. From her perspective, I was abandoning my family for no reason she could understand. I couldn't explain that I was drowning in the life we had built together. That staying meant continuing to lie to everyone I loved, that leaving was the only way I could hope to become an honest person again. My parents' farewell was equally painful. My father, now in his 70s, embraced me with tears in his eyes and made me promise to maintain my prayers even in a foreign land. My mother pressed a small Quran into my hands and begged me to remember the faith they had taught me. I accepted both gestures, while knowing that I was unlikely to honor either request. The flight from Tehran to Toronto was the longest journey of my life. Not because of the distance, but because of what I was leaving behind. As the airplane lifted off from Imam Khomeini International Airport, I pressed my face to the window, just as I had done 15 years earlier when departing for Hajj. But this time, instead of excitement and spiritual anticipation, I felt only grief and uncertainty. I was 34 years old, and I was starting my life over in a country where I knew no one, spoke the language imperfectly, and had no clear idea of what I wanted to become. I had escaped the constraints of religious society, but I had also given up the warmth of religious community. I was finally free to be honest about my doubts, but I had no one left to be honest with. The first months in Toronto were brutal. I lived in a small apartment in the north end of the city, working in a warehouse during the day and trying to establish connections in the carpet import business during the evenings. The work was physically exhausting and mentally numbing, a far cry from the respect and autonomy I had enjoyed as a business owner in Tehran. The cultural adjustment was overwhelming. Everything from the way people interacted in stores to the sounds of the city at night was different from what I had known. I found myself missing things I hadn't expected to miss. The call to prayer that had structured my days, the scent of saffron and rosewater that had filled my mother's kitchen, the easy familiarity of people who shared my cultural references and understood my history without explanation. Most of all, I missed having a clear sense of purpose and meaning. In Iran, even during my years of doubt, I had been part of something larger than myself. I had been a son, a husband, a father, a member of a community that stretched back centuries. In Toronto, I was just another immigrant trying to make a living in a society that didn't particularly care whether I succeeded or failed. The loneliness was crushing. I would call Zara every week, and our conversations were stilted and painful. She would update me on the children's schooling and health, but she was clearly still angry about my departure. Mariam and Darius would say hello, but they seemed increasingly distant, as though I was becoming a stranger to them. I began to fear that I was losing my children as well as my marriage. During this period, I tried to connect with Toronto's Iranian expatriate community, but most of the Iranians I met were either still religious Muslims or had become thoroughly secular. I didn't fit comfortably with either group. The religious Iranians made me uncomfortable because I had to pretend to share beliefs I had rejected. The secular Iranians often had an anger toward Islam that I couldn't quite match, despite my own doubts. I was caught in a strange middle ground, no longer a believer but not yet comfortable calling myself an atheist or even an agnostic. I had rejected the specific claims of Islam, but I hadn't yet figured out what, if anything, I believed about the larger questions of existence and meaning. I was spiritually homeless in every sense of the word. The worst moments came late at night, when I would lie in my small apartment, listening to the sounds of a city that never quite went to sleep. I would think about my children growing up without their father, about my parents aging without their eldest son nearby, about the life I had built and then abandoned. I would wonder if I had made a terrible mistake, if the freedom to doubt was worth the cost of losing everyone I loved. But then I would remember the suffocating feeling of having to lie every day about what I believed. I would recall the terror of being discovered as a fraud, the exhaustion of pretending to be someone I wasn't, the gradual erosion of my integrity as I participated in rituals that had become meaningless to me. And I would realize that, painful as my current situation was, it was still better than the alternative. I was alone, confused, and struggling financially. But for the first time in years, I was being honest about who I was, even if I wasn't entirely sure who that person might turn out to be. I was no longer living a lie, even though I hadn't yet discovered what truth might replace it. This was my life for almost 3 years, working, surviving, slowly adapting to Canadian society while remaining spiritually and emotionally adrift. I had escaped the constraints of Islamic fundamentalism, but I hadn't found anything to replace the structure and meaning that religion had once provided. I was free, but freedom without purpose felt more like emptiness than liberation. I didn't know it then, but I was about to meet people who would show me that losing one's religion doesn't have to mean losing one's faith. It might just mean finding a different kind of faith altogether. The emptiness I was experiencing wasn't the end of my spiritual journey, but simply the clearing away of old foundations so that something new could be built. But that discovery was still months away. For now, there was only the daily struggle to survive in a new country, the nightly phone calls to children who were becoming strangers, and the constant question of whether the freedom I had gained was worth the price I had paid for it. The warehouse where I worked in my second year in Toronto was a cold, industrial building on the outskirts of the city. We processed textiles and home furnishings for import, and the work was repetitive and physically demanding. Most of my coworkers were immigrants like me, people from different countries who had come to Canada seeking better opportunities and found themselves doing manual labor while they figured out how to rebuild their professional lives. I kept to myself during those months. My English was functional but not fluent, and I felt self-conscious about my accent and my limited vocabulary. More than that, I was still dealing with the emotional exhaustion of my separation from my family and my ongoing spiritual confusion. I went to work, did my job, and went home to my empty apartment. It wasn't much of a life, but it was the only life I could manage at the time. That changed when David started working at the warehouse. David was a Canadian in his 40s who had taken the job temporarily while he transitioned between careers. He had been laid off from his position at an accounting firm and needed work while he studied for additional certifications. Unlike most temporary workers who kept their heads down and counted the days until they could leave, David seemed genuinely interested in getting to know his coworkers. He was paired with me for several shifts, and I was initially wary of his friendliness. In my experience, when people were unusually kind to immigrants, they usually wanted something in return. But David's interest seemed genuine. He asked me about Iran, about my family, about my impressions of Canada. He listened to my broken English with patience and without the condescending smile I had gotten used to from other native speakers. What struck me most about David was how he treated everyone at the warehouse. He spoke to the Somali refugees with the same respect he showed the Polish graduate students. He helped the elderly Filipino woman with heavy boxes without making a show of it. He shared his lunch with whoever had forgotten to bring food, and he never seemed to expect anything in return. After working together for several weeks, David invited me to have coffee with him after work. I was hesitant. I wasn't used to socializing with coworkers, and I wasn't sure what we would talk about. But there was something about his manner that made me feel safe, so I agreed. We went to a small cafe near the warehouse, and David asked me more detailed questions about my background. I told him about my carpet business in Iran, about my family, about my reasons for coming to Canada. I was careful to make my immigration sound like it was purely for economic opportunities, avoiding any mention of my religious doubts or family conflicts. David listened thoughtfully and then began telling me about his own life. He had been married for 18 years to a woman named Sarah. They had 2 teenage children. He had lost his job not because of poor performance, but because of company downsizing, and he was using this transitional period to reassess his priorities and spend more time with his family. What surprised me was how openly he talked about his faith. He mentioned that he and his family attended church regularly, that his Christian beliefs influenced his approach to work and relationships, that he was grateful for God's provision even during this difficult period of unemployment. He said these things naturally, without embarrassment or defensiveness, as though faith was simply a normal part of adult conversation. This was completely foreign to me. In Iran, everyone was assumed to be Muslim, so faith was either taken for granted or discussed in very formal, ritualistic terms. In my interactions with secular Canadians, religion was usually avoided as a topic of conversation. But David talked about his relationship with God the way he might talk about his relationship with his wife, as something personal and meaningful, but not weird or uncomfortable. Over the following weeks, David and I continued to have coffee together after work. Our conversations ranged over many topics, but I found myself increasingly curious about his faith. He didn't try to convert me or ask about my own religious beliefs, but his worldview clearly shaped how he approached everything from workplace conflicts to family decisions. I began to notice things about David that intrigued me. When our supervisor was unfairly critical of one of the immigrant workers, David quietly intervened to defuse the situation. When a coworker was injured on the job, David visited him in the hospital on his own time. When the company tried to cut our hours without notice, David helped organize a meeting where we could collectively address the issue. None of these actions were dramatic or attention-seeking, but they demonstrated a consistent pattern of caring for others that I found remarkable. I had known many good Muslims who performed acts of charity and service, but there had always been an element of religious obligation in their actions. David seemed to help people simply because he loved them, not because he was fulfilling a religious duty. One evening, as we were having our usual coffee, I finally asked him directly about his motivation. Why did he go out of his way to help people, especially people like me who were foreigners and couldn't really offer him anything in return? David smiled and said something that I have never forgotten. He told me that he believed every person he met was someone whom God loved deeply, and that when he served others, he was serving God himself. But then he added that even if he hadn't been a Christian, he thought he would still want to help people, because seeing others flourish made him happy. This combination of religious motivation and simple human compassion struck me as completely authentic. David wasn't helping people to earn points with God or to demonstrate his righteousness to others. He was helping people because he genuinely cared about their welfare, and his faith gave him a framework for understanding why that care was important. After about 6 months of these conversations, David invited me to have dinner at his home. I was nervous about meeting his family, but I was also curious to see what a Christian household looked like from the inside. My only knowledge of Christianity came from Islamic polemics that portrayed Christians as either deluded or deliberately deceptive. I wanted to see for myself what Christian family life was actually like. David's house was modest but warm and welcoming. Sarah, his wife, greeted me with genuine kindness and immediately made me feel comfortable. Their children, a 16-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son, were polite and engaging without being artificially perfect. The dinner conversation flowed naturally, covering topics from my impressions of Canadian weather to their family's recent camping trip. What struck me most was the atmosphere of the home. There was no tension, no undercurrent of conflict or resentment. David and Sarah clearly loved each other and enjoyed each other's company. The children felt free to express their opinions and even to disagree with their parents on certain topics. Everyone seemed relaxed and happy to be together. Before dinner, David asked if it would be all right if he said a blessing over the food. I nodded, expecting something formal and ritualistic. Instead, he offered a simple, conversational prayer, thanking God for the food, for the opportunity to share it with a new friend, and for the love that brought the family together. It was unlike any prayer I'd ever heard. Intimate, personal, and completely natural. After dinner, Sarah showed me some family photos and told me stories about their children's activities and achievements. She asked about my own family, and when I mentioned that my wife and children were still in Iran, she expressed genuine sympathy for how difficult that separation must be. She offered to help me find ways to stay connected with them, and she seemed to understand intuitively that this was a source of ongoing pain for me. As I was preparing to leave that evening, David gave me a book. It was a biography of Jesus, written for people who weren't familiar with Christianity. He said he thought I might find it interesting from a historical perspective, and that I shouldn't feel any pressure to agree with its conclusions. I was reluctant to take the book at first. In my Islamic upbringing, I had been taught that the Christian scriptures had been corrupted, and that Jesus, while a respected prophet, had been misrepresented by his followers. Reading Christian literature felt like a betrayal of my heritage, even though I was no longer sure I believed in that heritage myself. But David's approach was so gentle and non-pressuring that I finally accepted the book. He made it clear that our friendship didn't depend on my reaction to it, that he wasn't trying to change my religion or convince me of anything. He was simply sharing something that was meaningful to him with someone he cared about. I took the book home and let it sit on my small dining table for several weeks. Every time I looked at it, I felt a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Part of me wanted to read it, but another part of me worried about what I might find. What if it challenged my remaining respect for Islamic teaching? What if it convinced me of things I wasn't ready to believe? What if it left me even more confused than I already was? Finally, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the loneliness of my apartment had become particularly oppressive, I picked up the book and began to read. The Jesus portrayed in this biography was unlike anyone I had encountered in Islamic literature. He wasn't primarily a lawgiver or a political leader or even a traditional prophet. He was presented as someone who had come to demonstrate God's love for humanity in the most direct way possible, by living among us, suffering with us, and ultimately dying for us. The stories of his interactions with people fascinated me. He spent time with outcasts and sinners, not to condemn them, but to offer them hope and transformation. He challenged religious authorities who had lost sight of God's compassion in their zeal for rules and regulations. He spoke about God not as a distant, demanding judge, but as a loving father who wanted relationship with his children. Most compelling to me were the accounts of Jesus' teachings about forgiveness and redemption. In Islam, I had learned that Allah was merciful, but that mercy was conditional on repentance and good works. Here was someone claiming that God's love was unconditional, that forgiveness was available to anyone who wanted it, that no one was too far gone to be welcomed back into relationship with their Creator. This message resonated with something deep in my heart that I had almost forgotten existed. During my years of religious doubt and spiritual emptiness, I had begun to think of myself as fundamentally damaged goods, someone who had betrayed his upbringing, abandoned his family, and lost his way so completely that there might be no path back to meaning and purpose. The idea that I might be loved and accepted exactly as I was, despite all my failures and confusion, was almost too good to believe. I read the book twice, and then I sought out David to discuss it with him. Our conversations took on a new depth as I shared my questions and reactions to what I had read. David was patient with my skepticism and honest about his own struggles with faith. He didn't present Christianity as a set of easy answers, but as a relationship with a God who understood human suffering because he had experienced it himself. Over the following months, David introduced me to other Christians in his community. I met Sarah's sister, who worked as a nurse and spent her weekends volunteering at a homeless shelter. I met their neighbor, an engineer who donated his vacation time to building houses for low-income families. I met their pastor, a thoughtful man who had studied philosophy and theology, but spoke about God with the simplicity and warmth of someone discussing a beloved friend. What impressed me about all these people was not their perfection. They were clearly flawed human beings, like everyone else, but their genuine desire to love others the way they believed God loved them. They welcomed me into their community without trying to change me, supported me during difficult moments without making me feel like a charity case, and shared their faith without being pushy or manipulative. Slowly, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was the reality of Christian love in action. These people cared about me not because I was a potential convert or because helping me made them feel righteous, but because they genuinely believed that God cared about me and wanted them to express that care in practical ways. The turning point came during one of my lowest periods in Canada. I had just received divorce papers from Zara, who had decided that my prolonged absence and spiritual changes made reconciliation impossible. The same week, I learned that my father had suffered a mild heart attack, and I couldn't afford to fly back to Iran to see him. I felt completely alone and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond my control. David found me crying in the warehouse break room during my lunch break. Without asking for details, he simply sat with me in silence for several minutes. Then he said something that changed everything for me. He told me that he had been praying for me regularly since we first met. Not that I would become a Christian, but that I would find peace and purpose and hope. He said he believed God had a plan for my life that would somehow bring good out of all the pain I was experiencing. As he said these words, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a young believer in Iran. The sense that I was not alone in the universe, that there was a loving presence that knew me completely and cared about my welfare. It wasn't an emotional high or a mystical experience, but rather a quiet, deep conviction that I was being held by something stronger than my circumstances. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed, not to Allah, because I was no longer sure Allah existed as I had once understood him. Not to some generic cosmic force, because that felt too impersonal and distant. But to Jesus, the God-man who had suffered and died and somehow conquered death itself, who promised to be present with anyone who called on his name. I told him about my confusion and loneliness, my guilt about abandoning my family, my fear about the future, my desperate need for forgiveness and hope. I didn't experience any dramatic transformation or supernatural revelation, but I felt heard. I felt accepted. I felt, for the first time in years, like I had come home. Over the following weeks, I began reading the Bible that David had given me along with the biography. The Gospels, in particular, spoke to me in ways I hadn't expected. Jesus' teachings about love and forgiveness, his compassion for the lost and broken, his promise that those who sought God would find him. All of this resonated with my deepest needs and longings. I started attending church with David and Sarah. At first just as an observer, but gradually as someone who was genuinely seeking to understand and experience what they had found in their faith. The community welcomed me warmly, and I began to develop friendships with people who had no connection to my past, but who accepted me completely as I was. The decision to be baptized came naturally after several months of study and prayer. I understood that this step would essentially close the door on any possibility of returning to my Islamic identity, that it would represent a complete break with the religious tradition of my ancestors. But I also understood that I had already made that break years earlier when I stopped believing in Islamic teaching. Baptism wasn't about rejecting my heritage so much as it was about embracing a new identity based on who I had become rather than who I had been. The baptism service took place on a Sunday morning in early spring. As I went down into the water, I thought about my long journey from certainty to doubt, to emptiness, to this new kind of faith. When I came up out of the water, I felt symbolically washed clean, not just of my sins, but of the years of confusion and spiritual homelessness that had preceded this moment. David and Sarah were there, along with dozens of other people who had become my Canadian family. They sang and celebrated as though my decision was as meaningful to them as it was to me. For the first time since leaving Iran, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. That evening, I called my cousin Reza in Tehran to tell him about my conversion. He was surprised but supportive, saying that he was glad I had found something to believe in again, even if it wasn't what our family would have chosen for me. We talked about the irony that I had come to Canada as a cultural Muslim and found Jesus, while he remained in Iran as an agnostic who still went through the motions of Islamic observance. I knew that telling my parents and my ex-wife about my conversion would be much more difficult. That conversation was still ahead of me, and I dreaded it. But for now, I was content to live in the joy of having found not just a new religion, but a new relationship with God that filled the emptiness I had carried for so many years. I was no longer the man who had kissed the black stone at Mecca, but I was also no longer the lost, confused immigrant who had arrived in Toronto 3 years earlier. I was Ali Hosseini, follower of Jesus Christ, member of a community that loved me unconditionally, and someone who had finally found a faith that felt both intellectually honest and emotionally satisfying. The hardest parts of my story were still to come, but for the first time in years, I felt equipped to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I had found not just a new belief system, but a new source of strength, hope, and love that I was confident could sustain me through whatever trials awaited. In finding Jesus, I had found myself again. Not the self I had been, but the self I was meant to become. I waited 3 months after my baptism before I found the courage to tell my family about my conversion to Christianity. 3 months of sleepless nights, of rehearsing conversations in my head, of praying for wisdom about how to break news that I knew would shatter the hearts of people I still loved deeply. 3 months of living with a joy I couldn't fully share, because sharing it would cause such pain to those who had given me life. The call I finally made was to my brother Ahmad, who was 2 years younger than me and had always been the peacemaker in our family. If anyone could understand my decision, or at least hear me out with some degree of compassion, I thought it would be him. I remember the exact moment when I spoke the words that would change everything forever. It was a Tuesday evening in Toronto, which meant it was early Wednesday morning in Tehran. Ahmad had answered the phone cheerfully, asking about my health and whether I had any news about when I might be able to visit home. The normalcy of his voice, the assumption that we were still the same brothers we had always been, made what I had to say even more difficult. When I told him I had become a Christian, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the connection had been cut. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was completely different, careful, distant, as though he were talking to a stranger who might be dangerous. He asked me to repeat what I had said, as if he couldn't believe he had heard correctly. When I confirmed that I had been baptized and was now following Jesus Christ, he was quiet again for a long moment. Then he began asking questions, not curious questions, but the kind of questions someone asks when they're trying to assess the extent of a catastrophe. Did I understand what this meant for our family's reputation? Did I realize that this would devastate our parents? Had I thought about what this would do to my children's future, knowing that their father had become an apostate? Did I comprehend that in Iran, converting from Islam to Christianity was not just a personal choice, but a crime that could carry severe consequences? I tried to explain my journey, to help him understand that this wasn't a decision I had made lightly or impulsively. I told him about my years of doubt, about my spiritual emptiness, about finding a peace and purpose in Christianity that I had never experienced even during my most devout Muslim years. I spoke about the love and acceptance I had found in the Christian community, about the sense of having come home to a God who understood suffering because he had experienced it himself. But I could hear in Ahmad's responses that my explanations were not bringing understanding. They were making things worse. Every reason I gave for becoming a Christian was, from his perspective, a criticism of the faith our family had practiced for generations. Every positive thing I said about my new belief was an implicit rejection of everything our parents had taught us. The conversation ended badly. Ahmad told me he needed time to think about what I had shared with him, and that he would have to discuss with the rest of the family how to handle this situation. He said he loved me as his brother, but that I had put him in an impossible position. How could he tell our elderly parents that their eldest son, the one they had sent to Mecca, the one they had trusted to carry on the family's religious legacy, had abandoned Islam for the religion of the West? I hung up the phone feeling sick to my stomach. I had expected the conversation to be difficult, but I hadn't been prepared for the immediate sense that something fundamental had broken between my brother and me. We had grown up together, shared a room until we were teenagers, supported each other through every crisis of childhood and adolescence. Now suddenly, there was a chasm between us that I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. Over the next few days, I received calls from other family members. Word had spread quickly through our extended family network, and each conversation was more painful than the last. My uncle Mahmoud, who had been like a second father to me, wept openly on the phone as he begged me to reconsider what I had done. My cousin Reza, despite his own agnostic beliefs, warned me that I was making enemies of people who had loved me unconditionally my entire life. The worst call came from my mother. I had expected anger, but what I heard in her voice was pure grief, the sound of a woman whose world had collapsed. She couldn't understand how the son she had raised to love Allah could have turned to what she saw as idol worship. She asked me over and over what she had done wrong as a mother, what failure in her own faith had led to this catastrophe. I tried to reassure her that she had been a wonderful mother, that my conversion was not a rejection of her love or her example. But she couldn't hear past her own anguish. She told me she was going to fast and pray for 40 days, asking Allah to return her son to the true faith. The thought of my elderly mother depriving herself of food because of my spiritual choices was almost unbearable. My father's reaction was different, but equally devastating. When he finally called me, his voice was cold and formal, the voice he might use with a business associate he no longer trusted. He told me that I was no longer welcome in his house, that my name would not be mentioned in family gatherings, that I had chosen to become an enemy of Islam, and therefore an enemy of everything our family stood for. The finality in his tone was crushing. This was the man who had held my hand as we walked to the mosque, who had saved for years to take me on Hajj, who had built his life around passing his faith on to his children. In his mind, I hadn't just changed religions. I had betrayed everything he had sacrificed to give me. But the most heartbreaking call came from Zara. We had already been divorced for over a year by then, but she had maintained some hope that once I worked through whatever crisis I was experiencing, I might return to Iran and we could rebuild our family. My conversion destroyed that possibility forever. She was not just angry, she was terrified. In Iran, having an apostate ex-husband could have serious social and legal consequences for her and our children. Maryam and Darius might face discrimination at school, might be questioned by authorities, might even be taken away from her if the government decided she was an unfit mother for having been married to someone who had betrayed Islam. Zara told me that she was going to change her name back to her maiden name, and that she was considering moving to another city where no one knew about her connection to me. She was going to tell our children that their father had died, because that would be easier for them than knowing their father had become what Iranian society considered worse than dead. A traitor to the faith. The thought of my children growing up believing I was dead was almost more than I could bear. Maryam was 11 now, old enough to understand loss, but not old enough to understand the complex religious and political forces that had torn our family apart. Darius was 9, still at an age where his father was his hero. How could I let them think I had abandoned them by choice, when in reality, I was being forced to stay away for their own protection? I begged Zara to let me speak to them one last time, to try to explain in terms they could understand why I couldn't come home. But she refused, saying it would only confuse them more and make their adjustment harder. She hung up the phone, and I knew that the sound of the dial tone was quite possibly the end of my relationship with my children forever. The weeks following these calls were the darkest of my entire life. I had found faith and hope in Christianity, but the cost of that faith was higher than I had ever imagined. I had gained a relationship with God, but lost relationships with almost everyone who had ever mattered to me. I had found a new family in the church, but I had been cut off from the family that had given me birth and raised me with love. The isolation was made worse by the threats that began arriving through various channels. Someone had posted my information on social media sites popular with Iranian expatriates, identifying me as an apostate and calling for faithful Muslims to take action against me. I received anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night with voices promising to find me and punish me for betraying Islam. Someone left a note under my apartment door, warning me that traitors to the faith would not be allowed to live in peace anywhere in the world. I reported the threats to the Canadian police, but there was little they could do about anonymous harassment. They suggested I consider changing my phone number and perhaps moving to a different address, but these felt like temporary measures that wouldn't solve the underlying problem. As long as there were people who considered my conversion a crime worthy of death, I would never be truly safe. The threats also extended to people who associated with me. David received a call at his home, warning him to stay away from the Iranian apostate he was helping. The church where I had been baptized received emails threatening violence if they continued to welcome converts from Islam. I began to worry that my presence was putting innocent people at risk, simply because they had shown me kindness and acceptance. For several months, I considered leaving Toronto and moving to a smaller Canadian city where I could start over with a completely new identity. I could change my name, avoid contact with other Iranians, and try to live quietly as just another Christian immigrant. The prospect of such anonymity was both appealing and terrifying. I would be safe, but I would also be cutting myself off from the last threads that connected me to my heritage and identity. But it was during this period of fear and isolation that I discovered something unexpected. I was not alone. Through David and Sarah, I was introduced to other Iranian Christians who had walked similar paths and faced similar consequences for their conversions. There was a small but growing community of Iranian believers in Toronto, and they had developed informal networks to support each other through the challenges that came with leaving Islam. I met Miriam, not my daughter, but a woman my age who had converted 5 years earlier and had also lost contact with her children as a result. I met Hassan, a former imam who had become a Christian pastor and now worked specifically with Muslim converts. I met Roya, a young woman who had fled Iran after her family attempted to force her into a marriage designed to cure her of her Christian beliefs. Each of their stories was different, but all of them involved the same painful themes: the struggle to maintain integrity while living in a religious society that demanded conformity, the courage required to follow truth wherever it led, the heartbreak of losing family relationships, and the gradual discovery that faith in Christ was worth any cost. These fellow Iranian Christians became my new family in a way that went beyond the warmth I had experienced from David and Sarah's church community. They understood not just the theological significance of conversion, but the cultural and emotional complexity of leaving Islam. They knew what it felt like to miss the call to prayer while simultaneously being grateful never to have to perform another obligatory prayer. They understood the strange mixture of grief and relief that came with abandoning a faith that had once provided structure and meaning, but had ultimately become a prison. Under their guidance, I began to see my painful experience as something that might be useful in helping others who were struggling with similar questions. Hassan encouraged me to share my testimony at Iranian Christian gatherings, and I discovered that my story resonated with people who were at various stages of their own spiritual journeys. Some were recent converts who needed to hear that the isolation and family rejection they were experiencing would eventually become bearable. Others were still Muslims, but struggling with doubts and questions they couldn't discuss with anyone in their community. Still others were family members of converts who were trying to understand how someone they loved could have made such a dramatic religious change. I found that I had a gift for explaining the intellectual and emotional process that had led me from Islam to Christianity in a way that was honest about the difficulties while also being hopeful about the possibilities. I could help people understand that converting to Christianity didn't require them to reject everything valuable about their Persian heritage, and that following Jesus didn't mean hating or condemning those who still followed Islam. As I became more involved in this ministry, I also began to understand something important about my own suffering. The family relationships I had lost were real losses that would always cause me pain. But the person I had become through walking this difficult path was someone who could offer comfort and guidance to others facing similar struggles. My wounds had been transformed into a source of healing for people who desperately needed to know they were not alone. This realization gave me a sense of purpose that helped balance the ongoing grief of family separation. I couldn't be a father to my own children, but I could be a spiritual father to other young Iranian Christians who needed guidance and support. I couldn't have the approval of my own parents, but I could help other parents understand why their converted children had made the choices they had made. The work was not easy, and the threats against me continued. I had to be careful about my personal safety, and I learned to vary my routines and avoid predictable patterns that might make me an easy target for someone wanting to harm a visible apostate. But I also learned that living in fear was not really living at all, and that the gospel I had embraced called me to take risks in service of love. 3 years after my conversion, I received an unexpected phone call from my cousin Reza in Tehran. He told me that our grandfather, my father's father, who was 92 years old, was dying and had asked to speak with me one last time. My father had initially refused to allow this, but the old man had been insistent, saying that he wanted to hear his grandson's voice before he went to meet Allah. The conversation with my grandfather was brief and painful. His voice was weak, but his mind was still sharp. He told me that he didn't understand the path I had chosen, that it grieved him to know that we would not meet in paradise as he had always hoped. But he also said something that surprised me. He told me that he still loved me, that I was still his grandson regardless of what religion I followed, and that he hoped God would have mercy on both of us despite our different beliefs. It was the first expression of conditional love I had received from my family since my conversion, and it moved me to tears. My grandfather died 2 weeks later, and I was not able to attend his funeral. But I was grateful for that final conversation, for his willingness to reach across the religious divide that separated us and remind me that love could survive even the deepest disagreements. That phone call also brought news about my children. Reza told me that Maryam, now 14, had been asking questions about her father's absence. Zara had tried to maintain the fiction that I was dead, but Maryam was old enough to find information online and had discovered references to my conversion. She was confused and hurt, not understanding why her father's change of religion meant she couldn't see him anymore. Darius, at 12, still believed the story that his father had died, but he was beginning to ask why there had never been a funeral, why there were no grave to visit, why his mother became uncomfortable whenever he asked questions about what his father had been like. The thought that my children were growing up with such confusion and pain because of my choices was almost unbearable. I began to pray regularly that God would somehow provide opportunities for them to understand the truth about my situation, and that they would someday be able to decide for themselves whether they wanted a relationship with their father. Meanwhile, my work with other Iranian converts continued to expand. I helped establish a support network that could provide practical assistance, help finding jobs, navigating immigration issues, dealing with family rejection, and staying safe in the face of threats. I also began working on a project to translate Christian literature into Persian in ways that would be accessible to people from Muslim backgrounds. This work brought me into contact with Iranian Christians around the world, and I began to understand that my experience was part of a much larger movement. Despite the risks and costs, thousands of Iranians were converting to Christianity every year. Some remained in Iran and worshipped in secret house churches. Others, like me, had left the country and were building new lives in exile. All of us were paying a price for our faith, but we were also experiencing a joy and freedom that made the cost bearable. We had found in Jesus not just a new religion, but a new way of understanding God's love. Unconditional, transforming, and available to anyone regardless of their past or their background. As I write this testimony now, 7 years after my conversion, I am still separated from my children and estranged from most of my family. The threats against me have diminished somewhat, but they have not disappeared entirely. I continue to live with the knowledge that there are people who consider my existence an offense against their understanding of God. But I am also living with a peace and purpose that I never experienced during my years as a Muslim or during my time as an agnostic. I wake up each morning knowing that I am loved by God, not because of my performance or my righteousness, but because of His grace. I go to sleep each night knowing that my life has meaning, not because I have achieved worldly success, but because I am part of God's work in the world. The cost of following Jesus has been higher than I ever imagined it could be. I have lost my family, my homeland, and the security that comes from belonging to the majority religion of one's birth culture. But I have gained something that makes all of these losses bearable. I have gained the certain knowledge that I am known, loved, and accepted by the God who created the universe and who chose to suffer and die so that I could be free. This is not a cost I would recommend to anyone, and it is not a path I would wish on my worst enemy. But it is the path that led me to truth, and truth, regardless of its cost, is always worth pursuing. My prayer now is not that the cost will be reduced, but that the fruit will be multiplied, that my testimony will help other seekers find the courage to follow their questions wherever they lead, that other families torn apart by religious differences will find ways to love each other across those divides, that the Iranian Christians who are still in Iran will be protected and encouraged as they live out their faith in dangerous circumstances. And someday, if God wills it, that my children will understand that their father's conversion was not an act of betrayal, but an act of love. Love for truth, love for God, and ultimately, love for them. Because the God I now serve is the God who promises to work all things together for good for those who love Him, even the most painful and seemingly destructive things. I am Ali Hosseini, follower of Jesus Christ, exile from my homeland, stranger to my family, but citizen of the kingdom of God. I have paid the highest price I could imagine for my faith, and I would pay it again without hesitation. Because what I have found in Christ is not just a new religion or a new way of thinking about God. It is home. And once you have found your way home, no earthly cost can seem too high to pay for the privilege of staying there.